Hi, I'm Ollie Neal, and you're listening to episode 16 of the Equip Project podcast. In this two-part conversation, we will be tackling perhaps the biggest and most controversial aspect of life for young adults, the issue of love and sex. This is a topic a number of our listeners have requested we talk about, and I've worked really hard to get Jim to sign up to this one. Jim, you don't look massively enthusiastic.
That's because I'm not. You dragged me kicking and screaming into this conversation. I mean, intellectually, I can see the significance of the subject for young adults today, but let's get real. I'm a 56-year-old repressed ultraman. I was raised to believe all affection could be expressed using a brisk handshake. So the prospect of a frank talk about human sexuality is up there with a visit to the dentist.
Well, I'm going to do my absolute utmost to make it as painless for you as possible. But I know you are aware how massive this is for my generation, how massive this issue is. Just this week, an author called Olivia Fain published a book called Why Sex Doesn't Matter. She argues that sex and love have nothing to do with each other. Sex should be regarded as a completely amoral act of pleasure. Why should anyone feel guilty about a perfectly natural way of gaining pleasure, she asks. And in a similar vein, the well-known atheist philosopher Peter Singer says sex raises no moral questions at all. So young Christians live in a world that regards their morals as a piece of nonsense. On Netflix, every new series seems to normalize all sorts of sexual activities, and it's actually fashionable to embrace various different sexualized identities. And even within the Christian community, Jim, there's a lot of confusion over how biblical sexual standards should apply in the modern world. So I think the question for us, Jim, is how can we bring some clarity to this complicated situation?
Sure. I guess the obvious thing to do is to set out the Christian view of love and the Christian view of sex. And we will then compare that with our culture's view of sex, and then we'll allow people to consider which vision better supports human flourishing.
I really like that plan, and I'm looking forward to hearing you kind of outline those differences. The question essentially is, what gives us a better way to live, Jesus Christ or our 21st century culture? And when we've completed that important exercise, Jim, in the next episode, I'm really keen that we tackle some of the major objections to the Christian view of sex, as well as talking about some of the practical challenges that young Christians face in this area of life. So stuff like, how should we deal with sexual sin? How can a dating couple keep themselves pure in a society that's saturated with sex? These are the sort of questions that I know our listeners will be very keen to have help with.
Well, that sounds like a joyous prospect. But there's no point handing out practical advice until the overall logic of the Christian position has been established, until we get to grips with the rational and beautiful vision of Christian sexuality.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly with that. So let's start by asking the question then, what is the Christian understanding of love?
I once gave a talk on the Bible's approach to sexuality and gender, and one member of the audience was a leading figure in Queen's LGBT community. And he had come to check up that I wasn't some, hate-filled homophobe. And after the talk, we had an entirely friendly and helpful conversation about our different worldviews. And in the course of that conversation, he uttered that famous phrase, I'm sure you've seen it on placards, love is love. Well, I said, that's either a meaningless tautology, or else you're saying that all love is sexual love. But no one believes that, I said. You love your grandmother and you love your dog, and I have no intention of finishing this sentence. Neither of us believes that all love should be sexually expressed. In Christian thought, love expresses itself in distinct ways. It has structure, if you like. There is the affection we feel for an old family pet. There is the deep and abiding friendship that's built up over years between two men or two women. And then there is unique romantic or erotic love that blooms within the institution of marriage. And then there is the altruistic, sacrificial love of God for us, the thing the Bible calls agape love. So love comes to us in a number of distinct forms: affection, friendship, romantic love, and altruistic love. Each element is absolutely delightful, and their distinctiveness is part of their beauty. I feel another silly illustration coming on. I wonder, can you remember your last Christmas meal, Ollie? Yes?
I remember it very well. I actually had 2 this year. That's the benefit of marriage. You get 2 Christmas dinners.
Anyway, it is a special moment when you lift your knife and fork and you get ready to confront this plate full of, roast potatoes and those little sausages wrapped in bacon and carrots, turkey breast, cranberry juice, gravy. Now, every element of the meal is delightful, okay? Each brings a distinctive quality to the overall experience. Now imagine that you would not be well pleased with me if I lifted your plate from the table, walked into your kitchen, and tipped the contents of the plate into a blender. Okay, I then return to the table, give you this tall glass full of brown goo, and I say, enjoy your meal. Food is food. I suspect you might pour the brown goo over my head. Homogenizing the meal destroys it. Yes, it is all just food, but we like the combination of textures. We like the way the sharpness of the cranberry counterbalances the comforting sweetness of the turkey and so on. Pouring the whole thing into a blender means that the essence of the meal has been lost. Its distinctiveness is an essential quality. When its structure is lost, the meal is lost, and only an unappetizing goo remains. Now, that same principle applies to love. The Bible doesn't regard love as a simple thing. It is a nuanced, multi-dimensional quality that expresses itself in distinctive forms: affection, friendship, romantic love, and altruistic love. Now, yes, all these things are love. At the deepest level, love is about the willing the good of the other. But part of the appeal of love is that it comes to us in different forms.
That view of love raises lots of questions about biblical boundaries for erotic love. But before we explore those questions, Jim, what is the Bible's understanding of sex?
Well, we need to make a couple of preliminary points here. And the first is that over the centuries, the Christian church has made a complete mess of its position on sex. In the early centuries of the Christian church, some downright weird theology became popular. It was believed, for example, that original sin was transmitted by sexual intercourse. And in Origen, a 3rd century theologian, he thought sex was so evil that he castrated himself. Augustine's unhealthy understanding of sex has done the church real damage. By the time you get to the Middle Ages, well, there's a theologian called Yves of Chartres, and he counselled the devout to refrain from sex on Thursdays in remembrance of Christ's rapture, on Fridays in memory of his crucifixion, on Saturdays in honour of the Virgin Mary, on Sundays in commemoration of the resurrection, and on Mondays out of respect for departed souls. Personalised T-shirts existed in the Middle Ages. Everyone would have been wearing ones called I Love Wednesdays. So we have to be honest and admit that the church's track record on dealing with sexual matters has not been good. Even today, I would argue respectfully that the Roman Catholic Church's insistence on celibacy within the priesthood is unbiblical and unnatural. So in complete contrast, the Bible itself is completely unembarrassed by sex. It sees sex as a gift from a good God, and there is an entire book of the Bible dedicated to a treatment of sexual love. I pray just about every day that the Lord will never ask me to have to expound it. I'm talking about the Song of Songs. And the song is a cycle of impressionistic love poems that tell the story of a young man and a woman as they fall in love, get married, enjoy physical intimacy, and grow old together. And in one of the poems we read these words: "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is as strong as death, jealousy is fierce as the grave." Now that verse matters because it reminds us that in biblical thought, there is something about the nature of romantic love that desires the stability and the enduring quality of a covenant. Okay, so in biblical thought, when a bride and groom enter the institution of marriage, they enter into what we might call a secure space. And the Song of Songs likens that space to a private garden that no one else should invade. Within that private garden, the song cycle overflows with exuberant, uninhibited expression of physical intimacy. So before you judge Christian morality, make sure you distinguish between the Bible's healthy view of sex and Augustine's profoundly unhealthy view.
And how would you describe the Bible's view of sex?
Well, in the second creation account, and that's in chapter 2 of Genesis, you find this beautiful love story where God presents Eve to Adam. In the Eden story, God had taken part of Adam in order to form Eve, leaving him incomplete without her. So when he sees Eve, Adam says, "At last." He recognizes in Eve the person who complemented him, not just physically, but psychologically and spiritually. And we hear him recite the world's first love poem, "Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Sexual union between a man and a woman is more than a union. John Stott describes it as a kind of reunion. It's not the union of alien persons who do not belong to each other and cannot appropriately become one flesh. On the contrary, it's the union of two persons who originally were one, were then separated from each other, and now in the tenderness of sexual encounter come together again. So the Bible argues for what we might call other-centered sexuality.
That sounds like an interesting term. Sounds like a positive term, thinking of others when it comes to sexuality. Could you just expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. Well, contrast it with prevailing culture, where discussions about sexuality usually begin with the word I. I like this. I have particular feelings. I need this type of satisfaction. But the Bible, as I say, presents to us what I have called other-centered sexuality. In other words, biblical thinking about sex starts not with what I like, but with what the other likes. Now, that idea helps us see heterosexual intercourse in its true context. It's much more than a union of bodies. It's a blending of complementary elements through which the rich, created oneness of human beings is experienced again. It's a reunion, making complete. The complementarity of male and female sexual organs at the physical level is a symbol of a much deeper spiritual complementarity.
I think that starts to make sense of the biblical boundary we call marriage. If sex is an other-centered union that involves the whole person, mind, soul, and body, then it requires the private garden you talked about, this secure space where genuine person-level intimacy can flourish over time.
Yes. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul writes, "Each of you should learn to know how to take a wife for himself in a way that is holy and honourable." Marriage isn't a form of legalised lust. Within a marriage, sexual union should be characterised by mutual respect and gentleness. Comedians today often make jokes about the way the authorised version of the Bible talks about sex, because the authorised says that a man knew his wife. But that language is a perfect description of sexual union. It involves a deep and intimate connection between husband and wife. I would go so far as to say that sexual intercourse actually changes people by creating a new reality, this oneness with another person. If you talk to any Christian pastor, they will tell you that when physical intimacy breaks down in a marriage, all sorts of alarm bells should go off. The Apostle Paul says it's a sin for a married person to withhold sex from their partner. Now, there's a whole complicated discussion behind that statement. There's lots of caveats that we could talk about. But for now, the simple point will do. The Bible is as concerned about no sex within marriage as it is about sex outside of marriage.
In a minute, we'll switch gears and think about our prevailing culture's view of sex. I think that's a really important area for us to address, Jim. But in your last answer, you talked a lot about complementarity. The difference between men and women, even at the physical level, allows this person-level reunion to take place during sex. Is that why the Bible sets its face against homosexuality?
Well, it's important that I approach your question with pastoral sensitivity. But the Apostle Paul's argument in Romans chapter 1 follows exactly the logic you have just set out. In Romans 1, Paul is charting out this great survey of humanity's fall from its original destiny. Okay? And people today get upset because the activity he highlights is homosexuality. And to some people that seems arbitrary and even unkind. But to understand the apostle, we need to see his condemnation of homosexual practice in its overall context. So here's what he says. Human beings are creatures designed to be in relationship with their Creator. But God is not like us. He's not part of creation. He is other. In the original Greek, the word otherness is hetero. And yet he says it's possible for us to enjoy intimacy with this other, the relationship between the creature and the Creator in a loving union. In his other writings, Paul uses marriage to describe that relationship between Christ and the church. The two parties in the relationship, Creator and creature, are different. They are other. But they aren't alien to each other because each is personal. And so, as in a marriage, this hetero relationship becomes an intimate union of persons. Now, says the apostle in Romans 1, humanity rejected that hetero relationship with their Creator and fell in love with creation. And because we're part of creation, that decision is really a move away from other-centered love towards self-love. Now, that's the context in which Paul raises the question of homosexuality, because it's an excellent illustration of the move away from the otherness of the Creator to the sameness of creation. Now, of course, that explanation doesn't dilute the offensiveness of Paul's critique of homosexuality. The real offence of the gospel in this department of life arises at the level of identity, because it looks as if a gay person's humanness is being attacked. And let me say, without caveat, that that is absolutely not the case. The 2 episodes we recorded, I can't remember what numbers they were. It's all a blur. But they were on the theme of identity, and they tackled that really complicated question. But when it comes to the much more straightforward question about homosexual practice, the Bible is quite clear that sex is confined to marriage. And the Lord Jesus goes out of his way to define marriage as a lifelong, faithful covenant between one man and one woman. Now, it's not my intention here to hurt or to offend. A not insignificant amount of my time in pastoral work involves listening to people who experience same-sex attraction. But it doesn't do anyone any favours to run away from the facts about the Christian worldview. We might choose to discard the Christian worldview, of course. But remember, you don't have to agree with someone in order to be their friend.
I think this is a really significant point, Jim. I know a number of young Christians who would say or would indicate that their view on homosexuality began to change when they became friends with gay people.
But that's an absurd thing to say, or at least it reveals the absurdity of their previous position, their previous objections to homosexuality. People who say that sort of thing are just admitting to past bigotry. They clearly had no rational or principled objection to homosexual practice. So I get mildly irritated. Am I allowed to get mildly irritated?
I think that's acceptable.
I get mildly irritated with Christians like that who assume their moral superiority just because they have jettisoned previous irrational prejudice. I spent years working with colleagues, some gay, some straight, and everyone who cared to know understood my orthodox Christian stance. But it didn't get in the way of genuine friendship. We just disagreed about our respective worldviews, just as I disagreed with Muslim friends. I remember once being out with a colleague for a meal with some suppliers, and in the course of the evening, one of them made a mildly homophobic joke, and I got really quite angry because my friend happened to identify as gay. And why did I get angry? For the simple reason that he was my friend.
So far in this conversation, we've set out the Christian understanding of love and sex. But as I said at the start, Jim, young Christians live in a world that regards biblical morals as nonsense. Students living on campuses may well be familiar with the so-called hookup culture. And according to the rules of that game, you're not meant to get emotionally attached in relationships. In fact, there aren't even genuine relationships. There's no commitment, there's no exclusivity. And there's a big dividing line drawn between physical intimacy and emotional intimacy.
Yeah, there's a weirdly polarised view of sex on campus these days. We're told that sex is nothing, and at the same time we're told that sex is everything. One moment it's just a bodily function, and the next it's almost like a religious worldview. So let's start with the sex is nothing position. Probably the best place to start is with the world of Tinder. That's a sentence I never thought I would ever hear myself say. But I remember reading an interview with a Tinder user who said this. She said, hookups are very scripted. You learn to turn off everything except your body and make yourself emotionally invulnerable. So sexuality is treated not as the embodied expression of other-centered love, but merely as an instrument for physical release and recreation. You quoted Peter Singer earlier when he said sex raises no moral questions at all. But that is a bleak, one-dimensional view of sex, and it reduces it to nothing but a physical urge. What about the deeper, the more holistic yearning to connect with another person within the security of a covenant? The hookup culture is described with horrible accuracy in Proverbs 30 with its portrayal of the moral fool who commits adultery. It says, she eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done nothing wrong. In other words, sex is just a natural appetite like eating. Christians don't think that sexual hedonists give sex too much importance. We think they give it too little importance. When someone treats their own body as nothing more than a physical organism driven by physical urges, they are isolating sex from the rich inner life of the lover and the beloved committed to building an entire life together.
And that's actually a very old idea, isn't it, Jim? Because in Corinth, some Christians had become infected, if you like, with that idea. It's just a body, some of them said, so what's wrong with sleeping with a prostitute, for example?
Yeah, Paul takes that example, and the interesting thing about it is that he doesn't just lay out a rule saying sleeping with prostitutes is wrong. He talks about what goes on in someone's body when they commit that act. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said the two will become one flesh. Now, maybe the best way to understand his argument here is to paraphrase it like this. Don't you know that when you hook up with someone, your body makes a promise, whether you do or not? We talk a lot about body language, don't we? And it's a valid term, because the body does speak its own language. The poet John Donne wrote that the body is like a book where we read the intentions of the soul. But by far the best book on this subject is written by Nancy Pearcey. It's called Love Thy Body. I'll just tell you, I was sitting reading it in a cafe once off the Lisburn Road. I had this book on the table in front of me. I was eating a large croissant, and this woman walked past, and she looked at the book, and then she looked at me. And I said to her, the full title is Love Thy Body Unconditionally. Anyway, it's a brilliant book. And in it, she cites some academic research that's been done about the hormones produced during sexual activity. Apparently, both men and women produce chemicals that encourage trust and nurturing. Piercy quotes an academic who says that during sex, our bodies make a chemical commitment to the other. So even scientifically, the attempt to reduce sex to a bodily function actually flies in the face of science. It's also degrading and coarse. We have to get real here. Sex has been reduced to a bodily function on a par with urination. So when somebody says, I need to have sex, I must get release, they're admitting to sexual incontinence. And sexual incontinence, like all forms of incontinence, isn't really something in which one should take pride.
We've talked about the view that sex is nothing, it's just a bodily function. But there's also this view around today that sex is everything. It's of such prime importance that our sexuality can actually define who we are.
Yes. So people like Freud advocated the sex is nothing school of thought. But then later on, academics like Michel Foucault came along. He was perhaps the main architect of the LGBT movement. And he saw the sexual revolution as a vision of redemption, really. Now, in one sense, it's obvious why materialists worship sex. Because if materialism is true, then all I am is the biological, the instinctual. So sex offers me the only route to transcendence. So Foucault saw sex as the master key to knowing who we are. He called sex the explanation of everything. It's more important than the soul, he said. In fact, he said, sex is worth dying for.
That almost religious view of sex might explain why people get so upset at the idea that not everyone seems to get to express themselves sexually. The denial of sex to certain people, in fact, seems a dehumanizing thing, because sex is seen as the regulating principle that orders life. Anyone who doesn't express themselves sexually is somehow a diminished and repressed human being. They're denying themselves in an essential aspect of their humanness.
Yeah, but that is a cruel lie. If it was true, then the Lord Jesus himself did not lead a full and complete life. He was never married. He never had children. But he lived a life bursting with vitality and radiance and joy and love. So we need to jettison the cultural stereotypes of single people here. Singleness is not sharing a can of tinned tuna with the cat while watching a TV screen in some desolate apartment. Think of those lovely words in John 13. The Lord Jesus says, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Now that quote mocks the profoundly stupid idea that all love must be expressed sexually. As I said earlier, love is multi-leveled. It's a multi-dimensional thing. So even if you live a life which does not include the physical intimacy enjoyed by a married couple, you can still live a life overflowing with love and hope and purpose. The Christian church was designed to help us forge a web of deep and abiding friendships, a set of loving relationships. So we should call out the sex is everything belief for what it is: idolatry. And like so many idolatries, the contemporary view of sex turns a good thing into an ultimate thing. As you know, I love all things said by Tim Keller, and he once famously said, "Idols always crush us." And the idols of the sexual revolution have had a crushing effect on people as individuals and as a society. Think of the pain and the loneliness of students who've tried and failed to decouple physical and emotional intimacy. I read about a student who sat in tears with her counsellor saying, "The student union taught me to protect myself against STIs and pregnancy, but they never taught me how to protect my heart." Or think of the catastrophic effect of pornography on a young married man's ability to develop genuine physical intimacy with his spouse.
And what about the effect on society as a whole, Jim? I think that's an area we haven't yet fully addressed.
Yeah, well, so far in this discussion, I have missed a central aspect of the Christian vision for sexuality, and that is the thing called the family. So excuse me getting personal for a moment here, but as you well know, I'm a widower. I got married in 1993. And like every young couple, my wife and I talked about how many children we would have and what we might call them. But some years into our marriage, it became apparent that we were unable to have a family. Now, I'm not sharing this in order to gain sympathy. I'm telling you because I've just raised a hugely sensitive issue about marriage. In Christian thought, one of its central purposes is to form and develop children. Now, if that's the case, was my marriage a genuine thing? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. My wife and I were privileged to have a loving and a joyful and fulfilled marriage. But the pain felt by a childless couple is bound up with the purposes of marriage. Our suffering was subtly different from the pain felt by a single person who's longed to hold a baby of their own. I'm not saying one form is worse than the other. I'm just saying it's different. Each type has its peculiar pain. Childless couples know in their hearts that their marriage is not fulfilling one of its normative purposes. Now, that was all terribly personal, but I chose to share it so that I can make this point. One of the normal purposes of any marriage, according to the Bible, is to form children through the physical union of husband and wife. It's one of the normal purposes of a marriage. And that observation leads me back to your question about the social impact of the sexual revolution. You see, at the societal level, Western society has collapsed because the nuclear family as an institution has been savagely attacked. Think of absent fathers, or divorce, or anonymous sperm donors. All these things have ripped the sense of givenness, the unconscious security that children have enjoyed in centuries past. For 5,000 years, the family unit has been the basic building block of every successful civilization. Only those ghastly experiments in Sparta deviated from the norm. But in our lifetime, that long-standing building block of civilization has been torn apart. And the hurt and loneliness that results, they're obvious to us all. The Christian vision for human sexuality is deeper, stronger, and more beautiful than all the chaos produced and the so-called freedom produced by the 1960s sexual revolution.
Jim, we've set the Christian view of love and sex against the views that prevail in today's culture, and I think you've shown the depth and beauty of the Christian vision for human sexuality. In the next episode, we have to consider some of the big objections to the Christian view of sex, and there are some big questions raised here. Why would God give us sexual desire and then tell us to repress it? Or what good does a marriage certificate do? Surely being in a committed, loving relationship is enough. I want to ask you loads of practical questions about how the principles we've talked about translate into the everyday lives of young Christians. But for now, the torture is over, and we'll let you go home and sleep for the rest of the day. Thank you for listening to episode 16 of the Equip Project podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with friends and family, or post a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you'd like to suggest a topic other than relationships we can talk about together, please email theequipproject@gmail.com or send us a message via Instagram.